Hi, and welcome to RAVE Leader Chat, week 19 for the Gospel of Mark. Since we did chapter 20 for Easter or the week after Easter, this really is the end. So first, I just want to say thanks and well done, good and faithful servants. Thank you for rolling with the changes as when we began this. First, it was the longest RAVE study that we've ever tackled. Second, we used to meet in person, and now we're meeting in rave groups virtually through Zoom. And I just thank you for your first your commitment to Christ, your love for His people, but your willingness to roll through the changes and make the best of a difficult situation. As I continue to make calls to the congregation, the rave groups continually get mentioned as what a blessing they are to connect, to grow deeper in our relationship with Christ, and to be a real community. So thank you for everything that you've done through this. I just count it as such a joy that God put us on this path before all this happened, and that God has raised leaders up like you to continue to love and care for His people. So let's turn our attention to this week's text. Kind of an interesting way to end our study on the Gospel of Mark with betrayal and the scattering. It picks up right at the end of the Garden of Gethsemane, the way that the thing is broken. And so we begin with the betrayal and arrest in the garden. A couple things to notice there. Question one kind of gets to some of it. The unique warped nature of Judas's honoring Jesus in some classical ways, and yet betrayal. So he's honored with a kiss, this very intimate sign that is the way that it marks that he's the betrayer. Secondly, that he calls him rabbi, which means my great one, really a term of honor. And yet it's the title that, again, serves a very different purpose. And when you get to verse 49, Jesus says that these things happen so that they may be fulfilled. The verse that's likely particularly fulfilled there is Isaiah 53, verse 12. And then notice at the end of that, we've sort of watched this last beginning of chapter 14, and in this chapter, you've had these extremes of Judas and Peter in betrayal and denial, but Jesus reminded them all last week that they would all scatter and they would all betray. And so verse 50, you get that all fled, all leave him in this moment. None of them are willing to walk with him in that. Verse 52, 51 and 52, it's funny, Spencer called the other day and read this and he goes, what on earth is going on? Well, it's question 3 does get it to a good level of that. I think it's this unnamed one who ends up running. He'd rather flee naked in safety than to have to walk the road with Jesus. And I think it's a good question for all of us about how quick we are willing to betray or flee, and how much cost we're willing to endure because of that. So it's a good consideration there. Then we get to the heart of the section. There's really sort of a sandwich at this next part. There's the beginning of the setting, then Peter, then this sort of interrogation, question, kangaroo court trial, and then back to Peter. So you get to the very beginning, and it just says that he's been arrested and brought before the high priest. And you've got the classic pieces there in 53 for the Sanhedrin. You have the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. They come together. Then you get to that initial Peter interlude. Question, is it 7 or 8's kind of the beginning of that question, and then it picks up in the denials. But notice how Peter stays close enough to discover what's going on, but far enough away, he thinks, to be able to remain anonymous and safe. And that's just kind of there as another form. This whole section has this dominant theme of testimony and witness. And the word witness or testimony, some variation of those two words, is used 7 times in 9 verses. But I also want you to be aware of how people testify with their actions. And so Peter's being set up for that, as well as what happens with this part of the Sanhedrin. So we quickly, after the introduction of Peter in the courtyard, we move to this sort of abrupt kangaroo court. Why do I call it a kangaroo court? Well, there's lots of things wrong. If we knew what the Mishnah taught about religious proceedings, and if we knew the overarching Roman government's responsibility to sort of anything that had a capital offense, we would know that lots of things are wrong here. And quickly, It's at the wrong time. None of these things take place at night. They all take place during the day. Second, they take place at another location very close to the Temple Mount, rather than at the villa of the chief priest. Third, you've got this process that at least 23 people from the Sanhedrin need to be assembled, and it seems very, very much thrown together in that. So you've got all these details that sort of say that the real thing that's going on is a quick move to find Jesus guilty. And so that's a testimony in itself to what's going on here. The other thing that's behind this text is the Old Testament desire, a requirement to need two witnesses. It occurs both in the book of Numbers and then twice in the book of Deuteronomy, that you need to have two witnesses, one to corroborate the other. Otherwise, the testimony really doesn't count. And that really kind of gets us to this. They take three swings at it, basically. In verse 55, they long for witnesses that they can just find who would speak ill of Jesus and substantiate their concerns, and yet they can find none. And that verse just speaks with such finality that what they're looking for isn't out there. So they try again. In verse 56, they decide to invite false witnesses, people they know are going to tell lies, and yet even their lies can't be substantiated. We're reminded, and I say this in the sermon, Chuck Colson said that Watergate, it was amazing how fast 12 of the most powerful men in the country couldn't keep a lie going for 3 weeks, and here they can't keep a lie going. When you're just making it up on the fly, it's really hard for your stories to match. And that's really what takes place in verse 56. Not satisfied, they give it another swing in 57 through 59. And now, instead of it being broad, what can you tell us about this, Jesus? It's very specific. What do you know about this cursing of the temple? And yet, even that, which Jesus, did talk about, and that really began that passage a chapter ago, chapter 13, as Jesus is going to replace the physical temple with his body in 3 days. Even when they call witnesses for that, it falls apart almost instantly. And so you get then to those three swings, 55, 56, 57 through 59. And then you get to 60 and 61, where the chief priest is wrestling with what to do. First, he asks Jesus to respond. What do you say about this testimony? And Jesus says nothing. There's sort of a silence that from the chief priest is troubling, but for us, it's really instructive. And really what's being fulfilled there is Isaiah 53, verse 7. There's this, lots of Isaiah 50, late 52, 53 is being fulfilled in the end details of Jesus' life as the suffering servant, takes away the sins of the world. And so he's silent there. Questions 5 and 7 really have some good discussion at this point about, why does Jesus break the silence now, and how does this contrast with what the role of his disciples and the actions of his disciples? But in question 60 and 61, verses 60 and 61, he really mentions that silence. And then in 61, at the end of it, the chief priest makes a confession, and that's really grammatically what the text suggests. Usually translations will add it as a question, but the grammar really says it's a statement that sort of infers the question. So I understand you to be the Messiah, the Son of God, period. Tonally, we should hear question, but it really is as a statement. And that's really what's important here, is that the chief priest really is, after Peter's confession earlier in the gospel and before the centurion at the cross, these are the three great confessions of who Jesus is in the Gospel of Mark. And although the chief priest doesn't necessarily believe what he says to be true, it's true. And that's why Jesus breaks his silence. Jesus has to affirm. And Jesus has to affirm not only because what is said is what God is revealing through this crazy set of details, but it also reminds us of the type of Messiah that Jesus is. Remember, Jesus was silent for a long time and told others to be silent for a long time about who he truly is, because it can't be understood fully without the understanding of messianic suffering in the cross. And so this is an appropriate time for Jesus to do that, as well as to become the corroborating witness to substantiate that truth. Well, Jesus' affirmation of that drives the chief priest crazy. He tears his clothes, this demonstrative act of rejection and shock. And then he asks the question, what other witnesses do we need? He means that what other witnesses do we need because he's now guilty of blasphemy. But really, what we read it to mean is, what other witnesses do we need? We have two testimonies that agree about who Jesus is, and one of them being Jesus. So when people say, Jesus never claimed to be, this is a great verse about, he actually says he is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. And so then that ends with the beginning of the mistreatment and the beatings. Blasphemy at the time really isn't an independent act so much as it's the ascribing God's honor to be applied to oneself, or maybe equally identifying or equating yourself with God. There is a good question in the book about that. Is it appropriate? How is it true? Question 6. Some good discussion there. And then this passage ends with 66 to 72, Peter's 3 denials. We are so aware of this passage, but a couple things I just want to highlight for you. One is just notice Peter's words, where even the chief priest unknowingly confesses Jesus as who he is. Peter, who's made that confession before, can't even speak Jesus' name. And that's just a very interesting dynamic. His thought that he could be close enough but safe enough still isn't realized. And then notice how his denials increase in fervor or in passion. First, in verse 68, he's got a double, I don't understand what you're asking, and I don't know that this applies to me. I don't know this situation. This can't really apply to me. And then second, he sort of asked about whether he's one of them. At this point, he sort of needs to distance himself even from the other disciples. It's not enough now. When we start to deny our relationship with Christ, it instantly ramps up to we have to deny our connection to other Christians then as well. And then third, in verse 71, he actually becomes very impassioned and swears by it. In this sort of kangaroo court thing that's been painted for us, you take an oath to tell the truth, and now he's swearing to deny that Jesus, that he ever even knew him. And then the cock crows 3 times, and so he breaks down and weeps. And it's just a good reminder of that weakness of the flesh talked about in last week's lesson, but also helps us search just how we might fail and fall. And so again, in that sort of wrestling with for question 11, what are the circumstances that we're most tempted to be ashamed of Jesus or deny him? I think there's a fantastic discussion there about where we really are. So once again, thanks for leading. We are going to take the next week off. And then on June 2nd at 7 p.m., there will be a Zoom link that will be sent to you about a RAVE Leaders meeting. It's going to be just getting people caught up and a little well-versed in Acts chapter, or in the book of Acts, as well as just hearing some questions and challenges maybe that we've got to Zoom. And also, now that the governor said we can meet in tens, what do we start to do with that? So we'll discuss a lot of that in that Zoom call. And then the following week, beginning with June 7th, we'll really begin preaching through the book of Acts, and that week we'll start with those. So thanks so much. God bless.